Today I'd like to introduce Paul Holmes, our guest speaker. Paul, welcome.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. It's a privilege to be here. Hobie is such a rock star in surfing and sailing that, like Prince or Madonna or Sting or Liberace, he's known all over the world by just one name, Hobie. He passed away a couple of years ago at age 80, and in his long and eventful life, he was a self-taught industrial designer, a tool maker, an innovator, an inventor, and just a pioneer kind of guy. All of it self-taught. He never went to school or had any formal training, but he just knew how to make stuff and make better stuff than anybody else. So he's really in an American tradition that, you know, recalls people like Thomas Edison and Henry Ford and people like that, except for one thing. Everything that Hobie did was to build people a toy, as he called them. And the toys that he built for people were designed to have fun in, on, and around the water. So his mission in life was not to, you know, come up with some high-tech invention. He was no Steve Jobs, but he was certainly an incredible innovator in the worlds that he occupied. Hobie actually grew up in Ontario, inland here. His father was a citrus grower and a businessman, active in local politics, served one term in the California legislature. So, you know, he was a businessman, rock solid member of his community. Here's a picture of Hobie looking very reluctant to have his picture taken with his two elder sisters and their dogs. That's up in Ontario. Hobie's mother was also from a citrus growing family, and her father, Hobie's grandfather, owned a beach house at Laguna Beach. So this is Laguna Beach in the 1920s, and the house is this house right here on Oak Street in Laguna Beach. So Hobie's mother was a devotee of the beach. She loved the beach and the ocean. So anytime that they had a spare minute, she'd whisk the kids off down to the beach, and they'd stay in that house. And so, you know, in school holidays, anytime they had a spare minute, this is where Hobie would be, down there on the beach in Laguna. One of the things that Hobie did not like to do was go to school. He hated school. He did not like books. And his father said to him, Hobie, you've got to go to school. All kids have to go to school. I'll tell you what, if you go to school, I'll buy you a fishing pole. So he bribed Hobie with a fishing pole to get him to go to school. And of course, Hobie loved that. He was down there on the beach every spare minute now catching fish. So, and he was good at it too. He was also always very active, curious, and loved doing things and making things. His family told me doing things and making things was what Hobie was all about from a very young age. And here he is up there in Ontario with a couple of model airplanes that he built, looking rather pleased with himself, I think, don't you? He also won, when he was like 6 years old, won a kite flying contest with a self-designed kite that he made. And he told me he flew on a piece of string that was 1 mile long. So this guy did not think small, you know. He had big ideas, even as a young lad. You know, in his mid-teens, like all kids, he got a little sort of, you know, antsy. Got his first car, the Chevy, got the black jacket and the look, you know. And his father noticed that he was hanging out with a bad bunch of boys down at the street corner by the drugstore. These guys were hanging out, smoking cigarettes. And Hobie was hanging with them, and they thought, oh, I don't know about this. This isn't looking good. But Hobie's father realized that Hobie was not like him. They were totally different personalities. And Hobie's father was smart enough to kind of get out of the way and not interfere too much or try to lay down a heavy hand. Anyway, one day he noticed Hobie wasn't hanging with this rough crowd anymore down at the corner. And he asked him, he said, "Hobie, how come you're not hanging with those friends of yours anymore?" And Hobie said, "Dad, those guys don't do anything." Hobie was always wanted to be doing things on his bike. He was an avid skier in his teens. And at 15, he took up surfing down at Laguna Beach. And he was a really good surfer really quickly. And he found out, wow, this is something I'm really interested in doing. So he started to find out how to make surfboards. And as we heard already, in those days, boards were made of balsa wood and fiberglass. And Hobie found out how to do this and where to get the materials. And by 17, he was making boards out of the family home garage down there at Laguna Beach. And this is what making boards meant in those days. You had to go out and buy the balsa wood lumber. You had to run it through a joiner. You had to glue it up into giant rectangular blocks of wood. And then you had to use hand tools to shape a surfboard out of it. Now, can you imagine the work that went into that? It was so time-consuming. Not only that, massive amounts of wood shaving waste came off of those big blocks. So after a little while, Hobie's dad said to him, "Well, you know, this is all very well, and I'm glad you've been successful at this." He made about 80 boards over 2.5 years at that Laguna Beach location. And his father said, "You know, really, if you want to do this seriously, you can't do it out of the garage anymore. You've got to get yourself a workshop." And true to form, you know, Hobie's father was very far-sighted. He realized Hobie wasn't going to go into the citrus business. He wasn't going to be a congressman. He wasn't going to do any of those things. So he encouraged him to start a workshop. And Hobie designed the place. And his father helped provide some cash, and they bought a piece of land down in Dana Point. And in 1954, this is the house in Laguna with some of the boards out front that Hobie had made. Beautiful, huh? And he had this hand-stamped logo that he put on it. He was a sort of intuitive marketing genius as well as a great craftsman. So nobody was doing this kind of thing in those days. Anyway, time to say goodbye to the beach scene in Laguna and move his act down to Dana Point on Coast Highway. He built and opened up the first surfboard making shop in the area down there in 1954. And that's what it looked like. If you're interested, it is now the location of Chronic Taco. And it wasn't much, you know, a workshop, a showroom, big sign right on Coast Highway, looking for the traffic that was coming up and down the road, going down to San Onofre, for example, which was a popular surf spot, or Doheny. So it was a really good location. And it thrived. His original intent was to make all the boards himself. Here's an innovation. This is a 4-way rotating wood glue press, right? Because he figured it took too much time just to glue up one blank. So he said, "Oh, I'll do 4 at a time" on this giant machine that he designed himself, tying them up with impact wrenches there. Then he could do 4 at a time. By the time he'd finished the 4th one, the first one was ready to take and shape. So it was like, the first step toward efficiency. He was the guy, ultimately, who started to make surfboards on a production line kind of basis. He had multiple shapers working for him, big glassing room where he could do multiple boards at one time. He kind of changed the way boards were made. One of his maxims throughout his life was build him a toy and a game to play with it. Well, there weren't any surf contests really in those days, so Hobie took it upon himself to go down to the Laguna Beach City and petition for a surf contest to be held at Brook Street. That's what we're looking at right here. 1954 or 55, they started the first Brook Street surfing contest. It's now called the Brook Street Surfing Classic. And it is actually the world's longest running surfing event, still being held today. That was the game. Hobie made all the boards. The people surfed in the first event, and that was the game that he gave them to play with it. Hobie was a great competitor, very skilled surfer. Every year during the mid-50s, he'd go out to Hawaii for the Makaha International Surfing Championships and also for the paddle races that they held in Waikiki. This is him right here at Makaha. He was a well-known big wave rider, placed well at the Makaha International Surfing Championships, which was in the day regarded as the world championships of surfing. And he also did well in the tandem event. Now this is like, people still do this, but it's a bit of a lost art. But it was in the 50s and even into the early 60s, it was hugely popular, where a man and a woman would go out and do these tricks, sort of a balletic moves while riding waves on a surfboard. I asked Hobie, why did you take such an interest in this? He, well, I could do it. He said, plus, if you won a surfing contest, nobody cared except the people you'd beat. Whereas if you won a tandem surfing contest, you'd get your picture and name in the paper, and that was good for business. So, while he was over there visiting in Hawaii in the mid-50s, Hobie saw these catamarans that had been built by a fellow named Woody Brown, who was also an ex-Californian. Woody had been all over the Pacific, and he'd noticed how the Polynesian sailing catamarans had asymmetric hulls. That is to say, they were straight on the outside of the hull and had a curve on the inside of the hull. And the Polynesians, being great seafarers that they are and were, realized that this design would allow them to sail closer to the wind. It would reduce leeway, it would reduce the amount of tacking they had to do, and give them a more direct line, especially sailing upwind. Woody Brown took this concept and he made the first beach cat, the Manokai, down there at Waikiki. This is the Manokai and a couple of its sister boats. The Manokai was regarded at the time in the mid-50s, it was built in 49, but in the mid-50s it was regarded as the fastest sailboat in the world. And Woody used them to take tourists for rides. Well, he loved it when the surfers came to visit because he could drag them out on his boat and they could take it way outside beyond the reefs and he could really let it fly. You couldn't do that with the tourists, they'd all have heart attacks, you know what I mean? So anyway, Hobie got a taste of that and it stuck with him. He didn't do anything with it for a while, but we'll get back to that later. There's a little close-up of a logo on a board, a balsa wood board. You can see the wood grain and the beautiful honey color that it made when it was fiberglassed. But in about 1957, Hobie realized that the entire business, his entire business, in fact, the entire sport of surfing, depended on a constant supply of balsa wood from Ecuador. That's where all the good wood came from. And he said to himself, this is risky. All we need to get is like one bad year, some kind of blight in the crop, or maybe a political coup, no balsa, no surfboards, no business, no surfing. We gotta fix this. He found a piece of stuff called polyurethane foam that had been shown to him by his chemical rep, Reichhold Chemicals. And he went, you know what? This stuff could be shaped just like wood. This stuff would make a great core for surfboards. He got together with a guy, a friend of his called Gordon Grubby Clark, and they set up a skunk works in Laguna Canyon, and they started experimenting with polyurethane foam as a surfboard material. Here's Grubby at the mixer, very high tech, right? These are high tech materials we're dealing with here. A bucket, 2 kinds of polymers, some accelerant, you mix it up in the bucket, you pour it in a mold, and you got a close to done surfboard blank. None of this cutting out big rectangular chunks anymore, more efficient, lighter, well, not a lot lighter, but somewhat lighter, just as strong, easy to produce, and lo and behold, by 1958, he and Grubby had perfected polyurethane foam as a surfboard component, and Hobie never made a balsa board again. He switched from balsa to foam exclusively. And in 1959, guess what happened? Hollywood released the movie Gidget, and surfing exploded in popularity. And Hobie was right there with his new material to cater to the new demand for surfboards, which could not have been met if they'd still been using all balsa. So there he is shaping now his foam boards. This is about 1960. And here he is with his collaborator in the enterprise, Phil Edward. And the two of them were lifelong friends through the end. Here in the early 60s, Phil Edwards was regarded as probably the best surfer in the world, both here in California and also in Hawaii. And in 1963, the two of them collaborated on a board which was a unique marketing concept in the way surfboards were sold. It was called the Phil Edwards Signature Model, and there's the logo for it. And it was the first time that a particular model of surfboard had been associated with a competitor. Now people do this all the time, of course. But at the time, it was like, wow, that's a real breakthrough. And of course, it was instantly copied. All the surfboard makers started to do it. But there was only one Phil Edwards signature model. And these days, those boards are collectible and sell for many thousands of dollars a piece. So if you've got one, hang on to it. Also in the mid-60s, Hobie took a shine to skateboarding. Skateboarding, he said to himself, it's kind of like surfing on the sidewalk. So he immediately realized that, hey, not all kids can live at the coast. Not all kids can go to the beach, but all kids can ride a skateboard. So being the innovator he was, he set about making some. Not only that, build them a toy and a game to play with it. He went to Baron Hilton, of Hilton Hotels fame. That's Mr. Hilton right there, and his family. And he showed Baron Hilton his skateboards, and the kids, Stevie and Davey, were like, oh, Dad, this is fabulous. You know, you've got to get in with this guy and do this. Well, it so happened, Baron Hilton also owned Vitapact Orange Juice Company. And Baron Hilton, being a shrewd guy, said, this is really good. Skateboards, orange juice, healthy, pursuit, kids, yes, let's do it. They made hundreds of thousands of these skateboards. They weren't the only ones, but they made hundreds of thousands of them. And Vitapact became the first sponsor of the California Skateboard Championships and ultimately the World Championships. So it was a really, really productive partnership until the wheels fell off because kids started falling down, breaking their arms and stuff like that. And cities quickly put the kibosh on it most of the places, and skateboarding took a big dive. It's come back since then, but didn't last as long as surfing, not in the first go-around. All this time, Hobie had been keeping in the back of his mind the catamaran that he'd seen on the beach and sailed in Waikiki. And here's his friend, Grubby Clark, sailing. These were known as the Outrigger, the Malibu Outriggers. And though it's not a catamaran, it's more of an outrigger canoe. These were the kind of local embryonic idea that Hobie then went on to develop. He started building scale models and prototypes. Like everything he did, he took his knowledge of the surfboard making and then started to apply it to boat building. So he would shape these hulls like this. Notice they are asymmetric, curve on the inside, straight on the outside. And he'd shape them out of big blocks of foam and then cover them in fiberglass and then go and try them out on the water. And eventually, he came up with a design for the Hobie Cat, and the Hobie Cat went into production, and basically the technology was just the same as making surfboards, except they were making sailboats, and they were molding them instead of hand making them. So the Hobie 14 was the first model of the Hobie Cat. Here it is. It's got the raised trampoline in the middle, single sail. The raised trampoline kept you up off the water and sort of helped you not to get drenched all the time, which was good. The metal parts that were required to put together the trampoline, Hobie milled all of that stuff on a lathe himself and then took these parts to a foundry and said, here, make more of these. I want about 10,000 of them. And they said, what, no drawings? No technical, no, just make them like this. Hobie never did drawings for his boats. He started with scale models and prototypes, handmade all the bits and pieces himself, and then had those things manufactured to his specifications, which were never written down. Boat was light. It had kick-up rudders. This was a tremendous innovation. You could beach this thing coming in through the surf and ride it right up onto the sand. The rudders would kick up automatically, quick release, an idea he'd gotten from seeing how ski boots released out of their bindings. So they were trailerable, kick-up rudders, single sail, easy to use, easy to get down to the water. You didn't have to be a member of a yacht club, sorry. You didn't need to have a slip or a mooring. You didn't even need access to a ramp. You could put this thing on a trailer behind your car, get it down to the water, didn't matter if it was a river, a lake, the beach, whatever, launch this thing and off you go. You're sailing. It was a radical change. A lot of people who were in yacht clubs didn't like it at all. The people with whom the Hobie Cats were popular called them the people's boat. But some of the yacht club people weren't so keen on this democratization of their scene, you know? Didn't matter. Surfers loved them because you could ride waves with them. And Hobie encouraged surfers to go ride waves with him, his crew, you know. In fact, he used to tell people, get out there and see if you can break it. Because he wanted to know. If there were stress points or places where it might fail, he wanted to know where that was. He encouraged people to get out there and try to break them. Well, build them a toy and a game to play with it. Didn't take long. Here's how they were laid up, the fiberglass hulls. Technical stuff. Hobie himself. There's that kick-up rudder we're talking about. See back here? When that hit a rock or the sand, it would just pop right up. Safe. Didn't take long for Hobie to upset the yachting world again. Because in those days, all sailboats had white sails, right? The only people who were allowed to use colored sails were on those big racing yachts with the spinnakers. Other than that, all sails had to be white. Hobie said, that's boring. We're going to make colored sails. So here's the Hobie 16, which was the next boat that he built in the series of catamarans. Hobie 16 was a bit bigger. It was had a jib. You'd get 3 or 4 people on board on those things, you know. And they were fast. You can see how the pop-up rudders work right there. And so he started making them with colored sails. Well, you know what? Not only was it, you know, a revolutionary idea, it was also a stroke of marketing genius, because if you were out on the water and you saw a colored sail pop up over the horizon, what kind of boat was that? Oh, it's a Hobie Cat. Sure. Couldn't be anything else. Built him a toy and a game to play with it. Didn't take long before he'd organized the class association. They were having local, regional, statewide, national, international competitions, a world championship every 2 years, racing Hobie Cats. And it was a tremendous social scene as well. People would come together and, you know, they'd race all day and party all night. It was quite something. The people who were into it were really, really into it. And it's still going on today. There's still 100,000 Hobie 16s being raced around the world today. The Hobie Cat enterprise became an internationally licensed deal. Sailing magazine a few years ago gave the Hobie 16 an award, the most produced sailboat in history. It is said about 400,000 of them were made, much more than any other boat. In his spare time, when he wasn't inventing things or sailing or surfing or doing whatever it was, Hobie was a maniac dirt bike rider. Any idea where this is? Laguna Niguel, you win. Laguna Niguel, right over here, see that? That's Crown Valley Parkway. That didn't exist in those days. You could ride a dirt bike out of Hobie's factory in Dana Point, through the hills there, clear all the way to Mission Viejo, which didn't exist. Early to mid-60s. They loved it. Hobie was really good, being competitive the way he was. He loved dirt bike riding. He raced, desert racing. He came really good at it. He was ranked number 27 in the state at one time. I mean, that's near professional level. All for something he did Saturday morning, couple hours to spare, go ride a dirt bike. Okay, remember? Doing things and making things was what made him tick. So what else did he turn his attention to? Well, wouldn't it be fun to go back to those? I enjoyed making those model airplanes when I was a kid. I think I'll do it again. So he did. The Hobie Hawk in the mid-70s was a remote-controlled sailplane, a glider, right? Took the world by storm, that world. Here he is on the cover of Model Airplane News with this groundbreaking new gliding machine. I mention it only because it was like, oh yeah, we'll do that. These things had a wingspan of 8 or 10 feet. They were big and hugely popular with the model airplane RC crew all over the country and in fact all over the world. It was a short-lived thing, didn't last all that many years, but just another invention. Also in the mid-70s, Hobie had sold his catamaran company to Coleman, the outdoor company. Coleman lanterns, coolers, Sheldon Coleman was really into what Hobie was doing. He owned the company and bought it on the condition that Hobie stay on as their principal guy, chief designer, and so forth. What it did for Hobie was it gave him a massive injection of capital to spend on new things. One of the new things that he did was this boat, which is the Hobie 33, 33 feet long. He wanted it to be trailerable, just like the catamarans were, but he wanted it to be fast. So he figured out the widest boat, the broadest beam he could make to have this boat be trailerable without stepping onto oversized load limits would have an 8-foot beam, 33 feet long, 8-foot beam. Sound a bit tippy? Yeah. So what he came up with was a retractable keel. See this? That's a lead bulb. And this would raise or lower in this ingenious way into the boat. Now, this boat would sleep 4. It would be tight, but it was trailable, and it was fast. The first thing they did with the first boat to come off the production line was to sail it in the Transpac race. And it won its class. They're still sailing them in the Transpacs today. There's not many of them around, but they're still out there. It was a super fast boat. In addition to the catamarans, which they did 14s, 16s, 18s, 20s, they did a whole series of monohulls too, some of which are long forgotten, but nevertheless, it was like, man, the guy was relentless. He never quit. Here's the 33 along with a slightly bigger ship you might recognize. And there we go. That's right off Dana Point here, flying along. Eventually, I could go on for hours, but I'm not going to. When he was in his mid-60s, we decided it was time to retire. The kids were now running the Hobie Cat show and the Hobie Surfboard show, his children. The class association was doing this thing all over the world. He just figured it was time for him to kind of move on. So he decided to look around to see if he could buy himself a nice cruising boat, not a sailboat, a boat that he could sail out to Avalon or take up the coast to the Puget Sound perhaps, or maybe all the way to Alaska. And he looked around for something, 30, 40, 50 feet, something that would be comfortable. And he told me, you know what? I tried all kinds of them. I didn't like any of them. I just thought they were bad. So I decided I'd make my own. Okay, so he decided he'd make his own Power Cat, 60-foot long Power Cat. And he started, like everything else, by making a scale model, 1 inch to 1 foot. And then he got his team together and said, okay, boys, we're going to make this boat. Here's the design. Let's go. He's standing here underneath the giant molds for the hulls. And took a few years and about $1.5 million. He made all the bits and pieces himself. He turned all the metal beads on a lathe and took them to the foundry and said, here, make me 4 more of these. Katiesue, while he was making his boat, Dennis Conner had set up shop across the street, and he was engaged in making Stars and Stripes, right? The America's Cup winning catamaran. And he had Hobie lend him a whole bunch of Hobie's catamaran workers to work on this new boat because he figured, well, they were the guys who knew how to do it. You might as well hire the best. So Hobie said, sure, my guys can come and work with you for a bit. So they did, and they built the Stars and Stripes. Here it is in sea trials right off Dana Point. And as you can see, Dennis was so grateful. He used a sail with the Hobie logo on it, and he also had the Hobie logo here on the inside of the hull. How's that? When they actually raced the boat, of course, it wasn't flying those insignia, but nevertheless, it was a nice thing. Here's the Katiesue finished down at Dana Point Harbor. A beautiful boat, absolutely fabulous, inside and out, super comfortable, super stable. I describe it in the book as a luxury hotel suite that makes 20 knots. And he took it to his new home, which he'd purchased up at Orcas Island in the San Juan group. And there it is anchored against the dock there, along with his crabbing boat over here on the left. From there, he and his wife cruised off to Alaska and did all these adventures on this fabulous boat and had a fine old time in his later years. Up behind the house here, he built a lake so he could stock it with trout, so he could practice his fly fishing. Oh yeah, quit, retired? Hardly retired. Here was his workshop behind the house, which has everything in it you could possibly imagine. Every tool, every machine, anything he wanted to do, he could just do right there. So one of the things he did was he built a scale model floatplane. The idea was, if he could get this thing to fly properly, he was going to make a full-scale one. It was the only project that he took on that he never actually finished, although this scale model did fly. There they are up at the Glacier Bay or somewhere up Alaska, Hobie and his wife. Hobie's interest in fly fishing went so far as to, I don't like standing up on my knees or waist in cold water. I don't like floating around on those, like inflatable thingies and getting my butt wet. I'm going to make a float cat for fly fishermen. Yeah, Hobie taught his cats to fish. So this is 2012, I believe. He was inducted into the National Sailing Hall of Fame, along with Dennis Conner, Ted Turner. There may be some faces you guys recognize there that don't mean a lot to me, but all of these people are luminaries in the world of sailing. And there's Hobie receiving his induction into the National Sailing Hall of Fame, recognized for his contribution to the world of sailing. And he was recognized once again in the most recent America's Cup. That happens to be Oracle on a training run or test run up there in San Francisco while they were having a Hobie Cat regatta going on out of Sausalito. So here are the little Hobie Cats, plugging along at about 8 knots. And here comes these giant boats on hydrofoils going 50 miles an hour. However, when Larry Ellison accepted the cup and made his acceptance speech, he made note and he said, I want to acknowledge Hobie Alter for his work on Hobie Cats, because without his work on catamarans, we probably wouldn't be here today. That was quite an accolade. So there it is. That's my presentation. I haven't bored you to death.